My name is Trey Dimsdale. I'm the Director of Program Outreach here at the Acton Institute, and it's my privilege to be able to welcome you to the Mark Murray Auditorium in the Acton building for our Acton Lecture Series featuring Dr. Yuval Levin. It's my privilege also to be able to introduce Dr. Levin to you this morning. Dr. Levin serves as the Vice President and a Hertog Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., and he holds a PhD from the University of Chicago. You've not likely noted his essays and his articles that have appeared in outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the National Review, the Weekly Standard. Prior to his time at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, Dr. Levin served in the George W. Bush White House, and then before that as a congressional staffer. He's the author of several books, including The Great Debate, Edmund Burke, Thomas Paine, and the Birth of Right and Left. And this book, The Fractured Republic, which we have for sale in the back, and he'll be happy to sign copies of this once his talk concludes. His talk today is based upon this work, so if you enjoy the talk, you'll certainly want to grab a copy of this. Dr. Levin, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. It's my first time at Acton. I've been a fan from a distance for a long time, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you and chat a little bit about the state of the country. Acton really holds a unique place in its essential work of combining at once a love of freedom and a commitment to the principles and traditions and foundations of that freedom. It helps us understand where our freedom comes from and what it would take to sustain and uphold it. And it's a way of thinking that's especially necessary and especially important in a time of change, in a time of flux and uncertainty like the one we're living through now. And what I want to talk about with you this afternoon is that time, is how to make sense of it, how to think about it, where it might have come from, and where it might be headed in a way that ought to give us some hope, which is in awfully short supply in our political conversations at the moment, but needn't be. American politics these days is certainly drowning in frustration and anxiety. That's been evident as both a cause and an effect of the 2016 presidential election, but it runs a lot deeper than that, and it's been with us a lot longer than that. The 21st century, almost from the moment that it began, has been a very uneasy time for our politics. We've seen that in the tone and the tenor of our debates, in the kinds of elections and candidates the country's had, in the sorts of concerns that you hear expressed. Just listening to our political conversations at this point, you'd have to conclude that America is deeply frustrated. At first glance, our unhappiness, our anxiety might seem pretty easy to explain. Again, well before the last election. Our economy has been sluggish since the 21st century began, and not only during the Great Recession of 2007 and 8, the country's strongest year of economic performance in the 21st century so far, which was 2004, some time ago, saw a level of growth that barely reached the average of any of the prior 4 decades. The century also began with the worst terrorist attack in American history, which shattered our hope that the post-Cold War world might be a peaceful world, and things have not gotten much more stable since then. Our partisan politics has been intensely divisive and polarized. Our cultural battles about sensitive subjects from stem cells to marriage and sexuality to religious liberty to national identity have been fought at a fever pitch that's left a lot of people on all sides feeling besieged and offended. And some key indicators that cross economics and culture and politics, like family breakdown, like inequality, have also persistently been pointing in troubling directions for quite a while and have stood in the way of mobility and of the American dream for too many Americans. So the opening years of the 21st century have given us as Americans real reasons to worry. But there's plainly been more to the frustration of this period than just a straightforward response to some challenging circumstances. We've been frustrated, too, at the apparent inability of our leaders and our politics to confront these challenges, sometimes even to acknowledge them. Some of that inability or unwillingness to face reality has just been a reflection of the willful blindness of many of us voters and citizens, and some of it has been a reflection of a particular tendency toward escapism or denial among some of our leaders. And I want to think with you a little bit about each of those as we think about the state of the country. The blindness of voters, which often is reflected by our leaders, has been expressed above all, I think, in the tendency to respond to contemporary problems with a certain kind of nostalgia, with a sense that what's wrong now is that America's changed from how it used to be, and that solutions can be found by going backward. That nostalgia really overwhelms our politics now. Once you see it, you can't stop seeing it. I'll give you an example that I think will strike you as very familiar, not because you've heard this statement in particular before, but because you hear things like it all the time. So how many times have we heard a politician in the last few years say something like this? I'll quote a brief paragraph. Many people watching tonight can probably remember a time when finding a good job meant showing up at a nearby factory or a business downtown. You didn't always need a degree. Your competition was pretty much limited to your neighbors. If you worked hard, chances are you'd have a job for life with a decent paycheck and good benefits and the occasional promotion. Maybe you would even have the pride of seeing your kids work at the same company. That world has changed, and for many the change has been painful, end quote. Now that's Barack Obama in a State of the Union address back in 2011. But it could easily be pretty much any politician in either party now. We know it's not Donald Trump only because it's all incomplete sentences. But the sentiment could very easily be Trump. He also longs for an America of firm and stable industrial employment before foreign competition took it all away. When the New York Times asked Trump in April of 2016 when America was last great, when he speaks of making it great again, he pointed to the 1950s. And it's not just Trump, of course, with a bit more of an emphasis on the cultural cohesion or stronger families of that half-remembered golden age. These lines could easily have come from a Mitt Romney speech in 2012 or from really most conservatives at any point in the last few years. With a more explicit emphasis on the low inequality of that time, it could easily have come from Hillary Clinton or from Elizabeth Warren. America just isn't what it used to be. That's a key theme of contemporary politics, and it speaks to a public anxiety that often comes down to a question people ask in anguish. What has happened to our country? And you know, it's not a bad question, in a sense. Something big and significant certainly has happened to our country. And in its less cartoonish forms, today's nostalgia is understandable. The America that our exhausted and wistful politics misses so much, the nation as it first emerged from the Great Depression and the Second World War and gradually evolved from there, really was exceptionally unified and cohesive. It had at first an extraordinary confidence in large institutions, big government, big labor, big business that would work together to meet the country's needs. That confidence really is just stunning from our vantage point now. America's cultural life at mid-century was not much less consolidated. It was dominated by a broad, generally traditionalist moral consensus. Religious attendance was at a peak. Families were strong. Birth rates were high. Divorce rates were low. And in the wake of a war in which most of its competitors had almost literally burned each other's economies to the ground, the United States utterly dominated the world economy, offering economic opportunity to workers of all kinds, high skill and mid-skill and low skill. At least for whites in America, which is no small caveat, of course, that time really was exceptional. But almost immediately after the war, that consolidated nation began a long process of unwinding and fragmenting. Over the decades that followed, the culture liberalized and diversified as essential struggles against racism coincided with a massive increase in immigration, among other things. Meanwhile, some key parts of the economy were deregulated to keep up with rising competitors, and our labor market was forced by globalizing pressures to specialize in higher skill work that's diminished opportunities for Americans with lower levels of education. In politics, an exceptional mid-century elite consensus on some key issues gave way by the 1970s to renewed divisions that have gotten only sharper and sharper ever since. In one arena after another, America in the immediate post-war years was a model of consolidation and consensus, but through the following decades, that consensus fractured. By the end of the 20th century, that fracturing had grown from diffusion into polarization of political views, but also of economic opportunities, of incomes, of family patterns, of ways of life. We've grown less conformist but more fragmented, more diverse but less unified, more dynamic but less secure. All of this has meant many gains for our country, and we shouldn't forget that. Gains in national prosperity, in personal liberty, in cultural diversity, in technological progress, in social justice, in options and choices in every realm of life. But over time, it's also meant a loss of faith in institutions, a loss of social order and structure, a loss of national cohesion, a loss of security and stability for a lot of workers, and a loss of cultural and political consensus. Those losses have piled up in ways that now often seem to overwhelm the gains, and have made our 21st century politics distinctly backward-looking and morose. Conservatives and liberals have emphasized different facets of these changes. Liberals tend to treasure the social liberation and the growing cultural diversity of the past half-century, but to lament the economic dislocation, the loss of social solidarity, and the rise in inequality. Conservatives celebrate the economic liberalization and dynamism, but lament the social instability, the moral disorder, the cultural breakdown, the weakening of fundamental institutions and traditions. But these changes are all tied together. The liberalization that the left celebrates is the fragmentation that the right laments, and vice versa. That set of forces, liberalizing and fragmenting, diversifying and fracturing, are all functions of the essential driving force of American life since the Second World War, what we might very generally call individualism. In very broad terms, the first half of the 20th century, up through the Second World War, was an age of growing consolidation and cohesion in American life, as our economy industrialized, our government grew more centralized, and culture became more aggregated through mass media for the first time. National identity and cohesion were often valued above individuality and diversity in that period. In those years, many of the most powerful forces in American life were pushing each American to become more like everyone else. And the nation that emerged from World War II was therefore highly and exceptionally cohesive. The second half of the 20th century, and these opening decades of the 21st century too, then marked an age of growing deconsolidation and decentralization. As the culture became increasingly variegated and diverse, the economy gradually diversified and in some respects also deregulated, and individualism and personal identity came to be held up above conformity and national unity. In these years, many of the most powerful forces in American life have been pushing each American not to become more like everyone else, but to become more like himself or herself. Mid-20th century America, especially the 1950s and 60s, stood between these two distinguishable periods, and for a time could keep one foot in each of them, combining dynamism with cohesion to an exceptional degree. That kind of straggling of diffusion and cohesion, or unity and diversity, really was a kind of wonder to behold. It's not surprising that we idolize that time and miss it. It offered us a stable backdrop for different forms of liberalization, be it toward cultural liberation or toward market economics. But that liberalization has now done its work, and our society, in a lot of ways, is its result. We're a highly individualistic, diverse, fragmented society, economically and politically and culturally, and none of that is about to be undone. So we're going to have to solve our problems as such a society. Both our strengths and our weaknesses are functions of this path that we've traveled together, and we now will have to draw on those strengths to address those weaknesses. This is one way to think about what has happened to our country. It's the essential challenge of the politics of 21st century America, how to use the advantages of a diverse, dynamic society to address the disadvantages of a fractured, insecure society. But if that doesn't sound to you like the question that our politics is asking itself, that's because it isn't. Our political culture has not been very good at grasping either the challenges we face or the strengths that we face in confronting them. It's instead been overwhelmed by nostalgia, by a desire to reverse the process of liberalization and diffusion that's transformed our society. And so, whether in economic terms for the left or in cultural terms for the right, to recreate a consolidated, centralized consensus that defined our country not all that long ago. The first step toward a constructive 21st century politics would have to be to see that this kind of reversal is not really an option, and that we probably wouldn't really want it anyway. Instead, we have to think about how to address the challenges of dissolution and diffusion, challenges like the breakdown of the family, the loss of worker security, growing polarization and inequality, the hollowing out of our institutions and our loss of faith in them, by making the most of strengths like dynamism and specialization and diversity. We have to look forward. But the second facet of the failure of our political system to confront reality actually has to do with a failure to look forward properly, or rather with an unwillingness among our governing elite to acknowledge that its cherished vision of the future may not really be what the future ends up looking like. That cherished vision of the future is a function in many respects of an attempt by many of our leaders to make sense of the post-Cold War world by emphasizing the best facets of the liberalization or diffusion that I've just described. In the 1990s, elites of both the right and left in our country and around the West came to believe that the end of the Cold War could bring about an era of extended liberal peace. For America's intellectual and political leaders, that raised the possibility of making the most of advantages made possible by our decades of liberalization while overcoming or even ignoring the disadvantages, so that market dynamism could coexist with cultural diversity, and the only question was really how to spread the bounty of both of them. A casual observer of the 2000 presidential election between Al Gore and George W. Bush might have imagined that our two parties had found fairly plausible left and right-wing paths toward doing something like this. That campaign was an argument about how to govern after the end of history. Read George W. Bush's first State of the Union address, February of 2001, and you'll find yourself in an alternate universe. As Bush put it, America had, quote, a balanced budget, big surpluses, peace with its neighbors. The question is how not to waste our opportunities. Just 1 year later, in his second State of the Union address, in January of 2002, the world had changed dramatically. The September 11th attacks launched an era of insecurity and chaos. A recession had taken hold, too, and the foundations of our common life had come to seem much shakier already. History had refused to end because it never was on its way toward ending. We couldn't really perceive it in that moment, but that dark turn should have marked the end of the illusions of the 1990s. The illusion shared in common by many Western elites that the process of liberalization that I've been describing and the growing diversity of our societies, combined with the long-hoped-for end of the Cold War, would finally mean the triumph of progressive liberal democracy around the world, the achievement at last of the future that they had long been dreaming of. In fact, that is not what the progress of liberalization and fracture made possible, and it was not what the end of the Cold War made possible. Instead, they brought the resurgence of long-submerged forces, nationalism and populism, ethnic tensions and economic resentments. These would be the challenges of the post-Cold War world, the challenges that would torment the West in the early 21st century. And to this day, our leaders have not figured out how to govern amid the actual realities of this time. Global instability and rising threats, weak growth at home that yields economic insecurity and daunting fiscal challenges, and a culture at war with itself, the continuing fracturing and fragmentation of family, community, and social institutions. Political elites throughout the developed world have made the mistake of treating problems like these as threats to the dream of governing at the end of history, rather than as threats to the actual physical and social and cultural and economic security of their actual citizens. They've not grasped that their expectations at the beginning of this century were just an error, the function of a failure to appreciate the downsides of how their societies had long been changing. And so they've treated their people's frustrations as part of the problem, rather than as reasons to rethink key premises and change course. Our politics has been shaped by a public trying to tell its leaders something they don't want to hear, and those leaders responding not by listening, but by looking for ways to get voters to shut up. Increasingly, voters have refused to do that. We could see this dynamic in the Brexit debate in the UK in 2016 and in the politics of much of Western Europe. In the United States, it had been maybe most evident before that year's election in some of our immigration debates, in which a broad cosmopolitan coalition has repeatedly tried to roll over opposition to all kinds of increased immigration, offered its critics basically nothing but the enforcement of already existing laws, treated its own efforts as comprehensive, and attributed any opposition of any kind to ignorant racism. These efforts have done enormous harm to our political culture and persuaded a lot of voters that their leaders were lying to them and despised them. But those leaders still barely grasp what they've done here, acting instead on inertia from an era that they don't quite see has come to an end. This widespread disorientation among our leaders has left both parties adrift and unable to offer much beyond nostalgia for 20th century high points as an answer to the implications of the long-running fracturing of institutions that's transformed our society. 15 years after the dream of governing at the end of history should have been shattered, the best that the two-party elites could come up with was running George W. Bush's brother and Bill Clinton's wife for president. The two of them perfectly embodied the widespread, if implicit, wish that it could be 2001 again, if not 1965 or 1981. They both seemed disoriented by the world that they were forced to inhabit that year. This kind of drift, at times outright condescension of their leaders, combined with a long escalating loss of faith in institutions, has left many voters increasingly frustrated and angry. And what Donald Trump grasped in 2016 was that the unwillingness of leaders in both parties even to see and acknowledge these problems had created an enormous opportunity to appeal to frustrated voters simply by acknowledging their frustration, even without really offering any ways to actually address it, which he certainly didn't offer. Trump's diagnoses were always more important to his appeal than his prescriptions. Even his biggest fans never seemed to take his solutions all that seriously. He had grasped something about what decades of fracture had done to America's political culture. He saw that by 2016, alienation was an enormously powerful political force in our country, and that identifying with alienated voters could matter even more than offering concrete answers to their worries. Alienation is an idea that we sometimes associate with the political left, maybe even with a certain strand of Marxism, but it doesn't have to be. Robert Nisbet, the great 20th century conservative sociologist, defined alienation as, quote, the state of mind that can find a social order remote, incomprehensible, or fraudulent, beyond hope or desire, inviting only apathy, boredom, even hostility. This is exactly how Trump and many of his most vocal supporters frequently spoke about America in 2016. It was not the country they'd known. Its institutions were a fraud, rigged against the public. There was almost no hope for America's future, so there was nothing to lose by abandoning our norms and taking a shot on an untested leader. Disruption for its own sake was better than just going down with the ship. All of this was mixed for some Trump voters with a powerful sense of loss, which is not the same as alienation, of course. Trump's appeal to American greatness struck a patriotic nerve among some of his supporters and was certainly received in some quarters as a much-needed call to restore the nation's dignity and strength. In this respect, it appealed to some sentiments and to some voters who are frequently drawn to conservative politics. But what was new about Trump's appeal and what ultimately seemed most powerful about it had more to do with a kind of resentment that formed only a very partial reaction against the character of liberalism in contemporary America. It was certainly a reaction in the name of the honor of the citizens that today's elites treat with contempt, or of the workers that today's economy treats as dispensable, the traditions that today's culture treats as primitive. But it was a partial reaction because Trump generally channeled the frustrations of these Americans, but not their aspirations. He shared their resentments much more than their commitments, let alone their piety or their devotions. And so he tended to translate their yearnings into alienation of the sort that drew many other Americans to him. In this sense, he exacerbated the alienation that's so prevalent in our politics, even as he tried to channel it. This kind of alienation can sometimes make for a powerful organizing principle for an electoral coalition in politics, especially when hostility overpowers apathy among the sentiments that it breeds. But it doesn't make for a natural organizing principle for a governing coalition. The sense of lacking a stake in the country's governing institutions, the feeling that those institutions are remote or unresponsive, makes it very hard to know what to do when they fall into your possession. That uncertainty has been powerfully evident in Trump's performance in the presidency in his first year. And I use the word performance here intentionally because Trump has approached the presidency as a performer more than an executive in this first year. To the extent that he's tried to channel the frustrations of his core voters, it's been by things he has said, while most of what he's done has advanced an older, more familiar Republican agenda, if haltingly and at times incompetently. The question of what will become of voter alienation as a political force beyond that, a force that shapes public policy or drives the evolution of our institutions, therefore remains at least in part an open question, even a year and more after Trump's term in office began. And it remains open in particular because alienation is not the last word on what the 2016 election should teach us about our fractured country. It is joined by a subtle but powerful yearning for solidarity that points in more constructive directions and that also stands to reshape our political life. This, too, is clearer in light of the momentous couple of years that we've just been living through. Maybe it didn't always feel like the last election was an argument about solidarity. It was certainly a terribly divisive election year, even more than usual. And it sharpened the peculiar condition of our politics, which involves intense partisanship alongside unusually weak parties. But near the core of these divisions was a difference of opinion about how to unify the country. Voters were certainly dissatisfied with the choices that their own parties offered them, Bernie Sanders won about 43% of the vote in the Democratic primaries. Donald Trump won about 45% in the Republican primaries. And of course, in that case, it was enough to win the nomination and eventually won the presidency. Voters in both parties clearly were not happy with the status quo. But what can we learn about from their choices about just what it was that left them unhappy in this way? On the left, voters often seem dissatisfied with the Democratic Party's inclination to cast their needs and interests and identities as just more excuses for the same old economic tinkering. And on the right, voters were dissatisfied with a kind of rote sloganeering conservatism of much of the Republican Party, which repeated the ends of Ronald Reagan's sentences but had long forgotten how or why they started. In both cases, abstractions about freedom and prosperity seemed less satisfying than they used to, while gestures in the direction of solidarity seemed deeply compelling, even when they were not very well worked out. Because they weren't really worked out, these gestures could take some dark and brutish forms, but they were about how to unify the country and be stronger together. On the right, the idea has been that by building walls around our country, we might be able to break down some walls within our country. A revival of nationalism, Trump and some of his supporters suggested, could be a unifying force that works by excluding outsiders to include all insiders, and so by offering us a means to define all of us as one. On the left, the quest for solidarity is pointed toward the argument that our society is divided only in the ways in which human individuals in general are divided, by gender or race or ethnicity or identity, and that we can unite despite these divisions by recognizing that we're all human beings, but also acknowledging the value of and importance of those differences. This plays down our national identity while playing up our personal identity in the hope that it might offer some inclusive path to unity. And it means, among other things, that the boundaries between Americans and non-Americans should be fairly porous so that our humanity shines through. In both cases, these are very generous readings of what the right and left were saying, let's be clear. But I think that ultimately they speak to the underlying desires and intentions that add up to a kind of desire for solidarity. But they had serious problems. One key problem with the left's approach is that it imposes a kind of soft relativism on the culture as a whole, and does so with real coercive force against traditionalists, especially religious traditionalists, who are reticent to accept it. And coercive relativism is both incoherent and unsatisfying. It's dangerous, too. It puts our core freedoms at risk. A key problem with the right's approach is that unity pursued by exclusion almost unavoidably becomes divisive and ugly. And it can also seem inviting to people whose desire for a purified unity expresses itself in racial or in ethnic terms. The left's lurch toward solidarity, therefore, often sounds like a demand for conformity, even at the expense of the freedoms of speech and religion. The right's grasps at solidarity easily come to seem exclusionary or intolerant. But the fact that both the left and the right are eager for solidarity, that our politics is bitterly divided about how to be unified, is worth understanding, and it's by no means all bad. These shifting emphases of our two broad political coalitions suggest an underlying shift in our common life from an American politics that expresses above all a desire for freedom to one that, at least alongside that, also expresses a powerful yearning for solidarity. The experience of fracture, of the division and loneliness and alienation that result from it, is clearly at the root of some of that growing desire, and it could help to further define the challenge that confronts our politics now. That challenge, roughly stated then, is how can our diverse, dynamic society address the problems of fragmentation and fracture in ways that contribute to greater unity in our society? It won't do to pretend that we can meet that challenge by going backward. The golden age that we think we remember was abandoned on purpose because it held us back economically or culturally or morally, and because it wasn't that golden for many Americans. So how could we meet that kind of challenge? What we require is a political vision and a governing agenda geared to filling the vacuums that Trump's success has made apparent. We need means of addressing problems that combine in themselves material want and moral emptiness. We need to help people both meet their needs and be more needed. We need to combat despair and disillusionment by reviving some genuine sources of moral authority and reaffirming the case for both personal and mutual responsibility. We need to fight alienation by putting power a little closer to the interpersonal level and making the social order a little less distant. We need to pursue more unity by means that are suited to the particular forms of our diversity. and so to seek after the broad solidarity of a great nation, not the narrow solidarity of a small party. Obviously, public policy can't do all of this, but there are ways that it might be able to help. For one thing, using our diversity and fragmentation as a tool of solving problems will require an approach to governing that empowers problem solvers throughout our society, rather than hoping that just one in Washington will get things right. It means bringing to public policy the kind of dispersed and incremental bottom-up approach to progress that increasingly pervades every other part of American life, an approach that lets authority flow through our mediating institutions, that solves problems by giving people options and letting their choices drive the process. This more distributed, decentralized vision of problem solving is how the modern post-industrial economy works. But it's also the logic of federalism that's embodied in a lot of our constitutional order. It's the logic of subsidiarity, articulated by the best traditions of our civilization. It should speak to both the right and the left in different ways. Over the past decade and more, some ideas rooted in this kind of vision have been developed and refined by a circle of generally younger, policy-minded conservatives to begin with. From healthcare to education to welfare, taxation, regulation, across the full spectrum of domestic issues, they've worked to turn this vision into substantive policy proposals. They share some of the frustration and concerns that animated Trump's appeal, but not its alienation or despair with America. They want to appeal to people's aspirations as much as their worries, and where it's possible, they want problems to be taken up by people who can see each other face to face. This is why, to my mind, although Trump's successes in 2016 suggest that the right in America is becoming less conservative, the frustrations and needs that made his victory possible suggest the need for a resurgence, a modernization of American conservatism. That resurgence would have to understand itself as a civic endeavor as much as a political one, and it should aim as much as possible to uproot the disposition toward alienation and despair in American life, and to plant in its place the essential conservative tendency to love the good more than we hate the bad. That means looking to improve more than to scorn, to build on what works more than to tear down, to understand our inadequacies by looking at them in light of what they keep us from being as much as what they make us into. And it means taking up problems we face by beginning from the strengths we have and from what unifies us. A similarly decentralized or community-oriented progressivism is also imaginable. It certainly might come less naturally at first to today's left in America, but it could draw on a rich tradition of progressive localism and community and labor organizing that points in a rather different direction than much of what the American left has been emphasizing in recent years. And surely decentralization and federalism should have some appeal for progressives now in particular, since national power today means power exercised by President Trump and congressional Republicans. Decentralization is just one facet of the change of attitude that we need, but it's a particularly important one. It can't address all of our problems, obviously, but as a shift of emphasis, I think that it can help. Beyond the familiar applications of this kind of approach in school choice or in conservative approaches to healthcare reform, there are ways that forms of decentralization could be of use in taking on some of the distinct problems of our particular time. It could help, at least at the margins, but maybe also near the core, to combat things like wage stagnation and the loss of working-class jobs, by enabling experimentation not only with welfare and wage supports, but with different forms of labor law and worker organizing, and by encouraging competition in higher education and skills training to create new opportunities and options. But what about national unity? Decentralization could easily seem like a force for more fragmentation, more division, not more unity. But I think that would be true if the alternative were a cohesive and consolidated country. Because the real alternative in the lives of many Americans now is actually isolation and radical individualism. A more decentralized politics can work to draw people out of their narrow circles and into the public arena, toward a common space where Americans can see each other face to face, and where not every question has to be an all-or-nothing political fight to the death in Washington. So subsidiarity, or federalism, or decentralization can be a focal point for an agenda of renewal. And given the sorry shape of our national politics, it's a focus that should attract people from all parties. By beginning closer to the ground, we can start to focus again on what holds us together. Champions of localism in America often love to cite Edmund Burke's famous reference to the little platoons that make up our society. But we would be wise to remember the context in which Burke raises that line. It's a case not for fragmentation, but for unity. To be attached to the subdivision, to love the little platoon we belong to in society, Burke wrote, is the first principle, the germ, as it were, of public affections. It's the first link in the series by which we proceed toward a love of our country and of mankind. That first link is broken now, and a love of our country, even of mankind, seems to be in awfully short supply in American politics. Given the particular shape of our problems, it seems to me that we might begin to replenish it by taking on more problems where they're found and thinking about politics a little more from the bottom up. The past 2 years have made the need for that kind of approach to politics and policy much more clear, but they've not made its success more likely. Our work is very much cut out for us. Our country is frustrated and anxious, and so is having trouble seeing past its problems to its strengths and opportunities. We're witnessing the exhaustion of an old political order, but not yet the rise of a new one. That's one lesson we might draw from an election in which two 70-year-olds compete for the presidency. To see the way forward, we need to open our eyes to America's 21st century circumstances, to grasp both the challenges and the opportunities they represent, and to see how, again, applying our enduring American principles to new circumstances could point the way toward an American revival. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Levin. We have about 20 minutes for questions. Please wait for the microphone so we can hear them on our recording. Who would like to go first?
Sir, I see in your bio that you were the executive director of the President's Council on Bioethics. From my observation in last couple decades, liberals tend to characterize conservatives as science-phobic. It's one of the things that conservatives are supposed to be ignorant of and suspicious of. How big an issue is advancing science, whether it be in life sciences, whether it be in other kind of technologies, in undermining our unity, and is it a fault line in our society that we're going to eventually end up on two sides of? Is it, how do you handle that, which is both a scientific issue and for the conservatives a moral issue as well?
Yeah. Thank you very much for the question. I think it's a very important question. The idea of science as a fault line in our politics, I think, was closer to the surface 10 and 15 years ago when we found ourselves embroiled in debates about stem cell research, about cloning, that brought up elements of the abortion debates, that brought up elements of science debates, and it really seemed for a time like the left and the right were at war over science. The left in those arguments tried to claim science as its own and to suggest that the right was anti-science. I think what the right was actually trying to do in those debates, and I should say, I'm not a neutral observer of them. I was very involved in those debates, and as you say, was the chief of staff of the President's Council on Bioethics, and then later was an advisor to President Bush, among other things, on science issues. I think what the right was trying to do in those debates is to prevent science from becoming needlessly a fault line in our politics, to make it clear that it was possible to have scientific advancement that did not cross moral boundaries and force our country to make a choice between science and morals. And the stem cell debate, which was the most prominent of those, the argument on the right and the argument that President Bush advanced too, was that it was possible to advance the research without crossing boundaries, without crossing lines that were fundamentally moral lines about protecting human life. That debate, you may have noticed, has faded from the headlines. And part of the reason for that is that it turned out to be more or less possible to, in fact, walk that line. Cell science has advanced over these 15 years in ways that mean that it's not necessary to destroy human embryos for the purpose of research. And so the debate has faded somewhat. You don't have, naturally enough, people on the left saying, well, President Bush was right. But I think stepping back and looking at how that debate went, that is one way to look at how it went. But science remains a contentious issue in our politics, whether it's about climate, On the one hand, whether it's about, you see it on the left too. There's opposition to vaccines, which is not well-founded, but is very much part of the cultural left in some parts of the country. And so, in each of these debates, I think both parties want to say science is on our side, and this is an argument between ignorance and knowledge. But ultimately, these debates are deeper than that, and they're not really about science. They're about the moral character of our society. They're about how we prioritize. Both parties agree we should be devoting a lot of resources to science, and we do. The United States spends an enormous amount of money, public money, on scientific research, especially medical research. And the advancement of science is one of the things we agree about, though we do find ways still to fight about it as though we don't agree about it. I think a lot of the debates that we call science debates are, in fact, about deeper questions, and we should see them in those terms and understand them as speaking to questions that maybe rightfully divide our society. They're that important.
Along that line, where do you see the debate over abortion headed?
Yeah. Well, this is one place where I have hope. And I should say, by the way, that I have hope in many places. I'm kind of a bad fit for contemporary politics because I really don't think that America is going to hell. I think we have a lot of problems, but I think we have a lot of strengths too. And that one of our problems is that we don't see what our strengths are. And if we saw our situation a little more clearly, we would have more reason for hope. The reason I do have some hope on the abortion debate is that it seems to me that the rising generation in our country is a little more open to seeing that debate as less of an all-or-nothing proposition. The United States has an incredibly radical legal regime around abortion. We simply allow abortion from start to finish of pregnancy. And really, the arguments that are made in our politics in favor of abortion would function as arguments for abortion after birth. There's simply no moral stopping point. This is unusual. And even in countries that we think of as less religious than ours, as less moralistic in their politics, the actual legal regime around abortion is generally much more restrictive than it is in the United States. Generally speaking, after the first trimester, there are strict limits on abortion throughout Europe. I think it's becoming easier to imagine that happening in the United States. And for me, that's a good sign. I'm pro-life, and I think that it's important that our country see that the abortion debate isn't about, it's an example of how we mistake things for science debates. The abortion debate is not a biology debate. It's not about when life begins. It's about whether every human life is equal, a question to which you would think that our country in particular would have an answer ready, because our country was born by exclaiming to the world that we think that every human being is equal. But clearly we don't always believe that. And I think what we're calling our country to in the abortion debate, we as pro-lifers, is we're calling our country to its best self and its highest principles, to a belief in human equality. And I do think that there are more younger Americans who are willing to see it that way and to at least be open to more limits than was the case a generation ago. And so I have some hope on the abortion debate.
So I regularly feel that the sword cuts both ways, and you alluded to it at one point in your presentation when you said that modern-day liberals would likely fear a strong central federal government because of who's in charge. When you were working with President Bush, the party of individual freedoms presented, in my mind, probably the biggest government overreach to ever exist, the Patriot Act. Since then, we've never been able to get rid of it. I'm really curious how the two parties differ, and also how do we get some of the freedoms back once government has taken them from us?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. There certainly is a way, and when you work in Washington through a few changes in administration, you come to see this pattern where it's like the teams just switch jerseys when elections change, right? And so one of them when it's out of power, has a jersey that says, spend less and make government less powerful. And then it wins an election and it gives that jersey to the other party. And it takes instead the jersey that says, we have the answer, let's do it. There's no question that happens to an extent, right? Where are the Republicans who were worried about Medicare bankrupting the country a few years ago? They're certainly not the ones voting for the budget this year, right? That happens. But I do think that there are some fundamental ideological differences between parties. They certainly are unusually clouded over now when the question in Washington is, what do you think about Donald Trump? That's not even a political question. It's certainly not an appropriate organizing principle for our politics, but it's where we are at this moment. I do think that there are fundamental differences between the parties, and really in some important ways between left and right, that are differences that do reach pretty deep, and that reach almost to the level of anthropology, that reach to the level of whether you believe that human beings achieve freedom by just being liberated from things that stand in their way, or by being empowered by institutions that are structured to enable them to enjoy freedom. That's a difference that divides the right and left in some not obvious ways, and it means that our politics is more philosophical than it sometimes seems on the surface. I do think those differences matter, but at the same time, I certainly share the frustration that power has a way, as we should know at the Acton Institute, of corrupting. And power has a way of blinding us to the reasons why we sought it. And you do see that in politicians. I think some of the ways of fighting against that involve voters and activists and people engaged in politics insisting on the principles that got them into politics and on the reasons why they are where they are in our political spectrum. That does happen. There are differences. The parties are not the same, but they certainly don't always live up to their ideals. That's impossible to deny.
Is Trump an aberration or the new norm? Is populism the aberration or a new norm? And what could you imagine would be the consequence of the Trumpian era when he is done with his presidency?
Yeah, so you're trying to keep me from being too hopeful. In a sense, it's easy to answer, right? Yes, Trump is an aberration. Just look at him. He's certainly, there's no one else like him in our politics. But Trump is, the fact that he was elected and the way that he was elected is as much a function of some important political trends as it is a driver of them. I think more than as much. It is, above all, a symptom and not a cause of the circumstances that shape our politics now. This is, I think, without question, a populist moment in American politics, and it isn't going to be over at the next election. I think it's a populist moment in part, as I suggested in the talk, because our leadership for a long time has been running on fumes, has ignored how the world is changing, and has tried to rerun the 1981 election over and over, where the debate is the Great Society versus Reaganism. And that was an important debate, but it can't be that we just keep redoing that and insisting that our politics fit into these categories. I think there is imaginable and in some ways taking shape a more coherent 21st century left-right debate. But that, to get from here to there, will require a kind of generational transition in our politics. And the question has to be, who do you see rising up behind the current crop of leaders that could sort of populate that next generation? I think actually that it's easier to see that on the right for the moment than on the left. There are people in their 40s, in their 50s, in their 30s on the right who you can imagine being leaders for some time. There are fewer of them on the left. Not none, but certainly fewer. So that the right has a kind of variety of such leaders. You see them in the Senate, you see some governors like that. Are they populists? They're more populist than the people they're trying to replace. But I don't think that I would describe them quite as following in the Trump mold of populism, a kind of alienated populism that isn't conservative. I mean, there's no way that alienation ultimately can sustain a conservative party. But I think our politics now has to speak to a frustrated country more than to a country that's defined fundamentally by its aspirations. And that means both parties have to change their tone, but also their substance and their message. In that sense, this is not the end of the phase we're seeing. But I think that there's a way in which the last election, and in some respects in which Trump as a president, does mark an end more than a beginning. It's a sort of sign of exhaustion rather than the shape of the next phase of our politics. Again, that's what it means to see two 70-year-olds running against each other. It's also, you sort of see it in the cultural and economic appeals where it's really it's a populism that's directed literally at bringing steel back to Pittsburgh. That's not the future. It's just not. And you can ask people in Pittsburgh and they'll tell you that's not the future. So I don't think we're seeing the shape of the next phase of our politics yet, but I certainly think we are seeing an end of something that's pointing in the direction of a sustained populist period. Yeah.
I came across your work when I saw James K. A. Smith quote you in his most recent book. My question is, where do you see religious institutions, especially at the parish level or the diocesan level, what kind of contributions do you see them being able to make to build this bottom-up solidarity?
Yeah, thank you. I was struck by his citing me in that, but I'm Jewish. Jamie certainly isn't, and it's always nice to find to find that kind of ecumenical thinking. I think there are a lot of ways, there are a lot of opportunities for that kind of thinking now. That is, for religiously serious people of different kinds of Christianity and among Jews and surely ultimately in some respects among Muslims in America. I'm not sure we've seen that take shape yet. To think together about the shape of the culture because we have some concerns in common. I also think that if solutions are going to come from the bottom up, then it's absolutely essential that our religious institutions play a role in helping people address problems. There is no subsidiarity without churches in our kind of society. That's just impossible to imagine. And so I think part of what that means is a revival of a way of thinking about what religious institutions do that's connected to civic problems where they are. Some of our institutions are already very good at this. The Catholic Church does this a lot. There are certainly strands of American Protestantism that do it too, and that for that reason I think are very well suited for this moment and for speaking to the kinds of problems and hungers that people have in this moment. There are others, though, that tend to think politically in a different way, that tend to think politically in terms of trying to simply shape the national conversation rather than to present themselves, to exist as forces at the interpersonal level. And you see that too in certain strands of religious conservatism and also in some strands of religious progressivism that I think turn out not to be well suited to this moment and that are going to have to rethink what they're doing if they're going to find a place in an America that looks for solutions from the bottom up. But look, I think from education to welfare and healthcare to much more fundamental questions of how isolated, alienated people find belonging, of how they find a place to belong and to make a difference and to be needed. There is no way to achieve that without religion in America and without religious institutions. And so, for me, that means that the kind of solutions that I'm gesturing toward absolutely require some revitalization of our religious institutions and also just the involvement of those institutions that are vital already and that are waiting to be called on. I think this is a moment when they absolutely will be called on.
Do you see a distinction among the terms decentralization, subsidiarity, and federalism? And if so, do they have implications for your thesis?
Yeah. I try to use the term subsidiarity because I think it's the richest of those and the one that best applies. It's not always the best term to use because it is a religious term. It's a specifically Catholic term that I think has since grown into something much more than that. But the idea of subsidiarity, at least as I use it, is that power should reside at the lowest possible level at which it can do good. It's not an argument for decentralization in every instance. It doesn't say every problem should be solved locally. It's open to the possibility, the reality, that some problems need to be addressed at higher levels, including at the national level, maybe even at the international level. But it's a kind of preference for the interpersonal, so that when we think about how to solve problems, we should begin by thinking, can this be done at the level where people see each other face to face? And if it can, then let's try to do it there. I think that's the right attitude to a lot of the problems we have now. Decentralization is, in a sense, a more crude term, right? It just says take things that are at the center and move them out to the periphery. That often is how subsidiarity works, but not always. And of course, federalism is a more distinct term than that. Federalism in our system really means a kind of sharing of power and a recognition of the reality of the levels and layers of our system of government. Federalism has had a hard time in the last half century. It's been undermined by centralization of government power, but more than that, it's been undermined by a kind of willful, intentional confounding of different layers of government. That is, having them do things together rather than separating out their responsibilities and obligations has meant that oftentimes the state and local levels of government in America have lost sight of their unique strengths and their unique responsibilities. And they now just understand themselves as kind of way stations on the path to the federal government. So I think our idea of federalism could use some replenishment by an engagement with the idea of subsidiarity, which is more of a religious idea.
We have time for one more question.
I'm struck in the division of America, not so much between left and right, because the parties seem awful similar, as you were saying, but it's more between the governing body and the governed. For instance, both parties on the stump have said they're going to move the Israel's embassy to Jerusalem, and he said it, and he's done it, and now both parties are shocked and appalled. So you have that, and then also just governing from the Supreme Court. Can you speak to that? I find that to be the biggest thing that Trump's presidency has brought to light. Is in some ways he's actually getting something done that people have said that needed to be done, and now that it's being done, they're shocked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the example of moving the embassy is one example of that, but honestly, I'm not sure there are a lot of other examples of that. I'm struck at looking at the Trump administration that there's an awful lot of talk and not a lot of action. There are a couple of things that have been done. I think there's been tax reform, which any Republican president would have tried to do, and to his credit, this president has succeeded in advancing. And there have been very good appointments to the courts, which I also think makes a big difference. There hasn't been much else, and it's not clear to me that there will be much else. Now, that's not simply the fault of the president. Congress is also very dysfunctional, and as you say, our system of government is confused about where power should reside, and so both members of Congress and presidents of both parties just kind of do things and then say, well, we'll let the courts sort out if this is right or not, which is really not how our system of government envisions the role of the judiciary. And so I think that role has expanded and exploded. But, generally speaking, I think this is turning out not to be a very productive period in our politics. It's hidden from us a little bit by the sheer, entertainment value of what goes on every day. And so there's a lot to talk about. But if you really step back and think what is actually happening, the answer seems to me to be not all that much. And so certainly I think it's right in any populist period, and it's certainly right in our time to say that there are some sharp distinctions between the attitudes of the governing and the governed. I think that's true in both parties. And so as you say, it's not a dividing line between the parties, but between politics and the population. That's almost what it means to find yourself in a populist moment in politics, and it's why so much of the energy in our politics is anti-political. And the way to address that would have to be to have a politics that speaks more to people's concerns, that's more directed to the reasons why people are drawn into politics. I think for the moment, neither party is doing a very good job of articulating that kind of politics. And the president, although he speaks in populist tones, isn't really doing that either. There's not a lot that's changed about what our government does under this administration that understands itself as more populist. That could still change. We're a year in, and it's hard to say. But I certainly think the challenges that brought this political moment into being are still very much there. And you couldn't really say that they've been addressed in a way that suggests that things will calm down.
Please thank Dr. Levin.
Thank you very much.